Hey, how are you? I'm going to read from this leadership book, Leadership Theory and Practice. It's by Northouse. I'm in chapter 5. I'm in the section titled Criticisms. It's on page 102 and goes past 103. Criticisms. Situational leadership. Criticisms. Despite its history of the use of leadership training and development, situational leadership has several limitations. The following criticisms point out several weaknesses in this approach and help to provide a more balanced picture of the general utility of this approach in studying and practicing leadership. The first criticism of situational leadership is that only a few research studies have been conducted to justify the assumptions and propositions set forth by the approach. Although many doctoral dissertations address dimensions of situational leadership, most of these research studies have not been published. The lack of a strong body of research on this approach raises questions about the theoretical basis of the approach. Can we be sure it is a valid approach? Is it certain that this approach does indeed improve performance? Does this approach compare favorably with other leadership approaches in its impact on followers? It is difficult to give firm answers to these questions when the testing of this approach has not resulted in a significant amount of published research findings. A second criticism that can be directed at the situational approach concerns the ambiguous conceptualization in the model of the followers' development levels. The authors of the models do not make clear how commitment is combined with competence to form 4 distinct levels of development. In one of the earliest versions of the model, Hershey and Blanchard in '69 defined the 4 levels of commitment, maturity as unwilling and unable, level 1, willing and unable, level 2, unwilling and able, level 3, and willing and able, level 4. In more recent version, represented by the SL2 Situational Leadership 2 model, development level is described as high commitment and low competence in D1, low commitment and some competence in D2, variable commitment and high competence in D3, and high commitment and high competence in D4. The authors of situational leaderships do not explain the theoretical basis for these changes in the composition of each of the developmental levels. Furthermore, they do not explain how competence and commitment are weighted across different developmental levels. As pointed out by Blanchard and others in '93, there is a need for further research to establish how competence and commitment are conceptualized for each development level. Closely related to the general criticism of ambiguity about followers' development levels is a concern with how commitment itself is conceptualized in the model. For example, Graff in '97 suggested that conceptualization is very unclear. Blanchard and others in 2013 stated that followers' commitment is composed of confidence and motivation, but it's not clear how confidence and motivation combine to define commitment. According to SL2 model, commitment starts out high in D1, moves down in D2, becomes variable in D3, and rises again in D4. Intuitively, it appears more logical to describe followers' commitment as existing on a continuum moving from low to moderate to high. The argument provided by Blanchard and others in '93 for how commitment varies in the SL2 model is that followers usually start out motivated and eager to learn, and then they may become discouraged and disillusioned. Next, they may begin to lack confidence or motivation, or both, and last, they become highly confident and motivated. But why is this so? Why do followers who learn a task become less committed? Why is there a decrease in commitment at developmental levels 2 and 3? Some clarification of the ambiguity surrounding developmental levels is suggested by Thompson and Glasso in 2015, who studied a sample of 80 supervisors and 357 followers in financial organizations and found that the prediction of the earlier model of the situational leadership are more likely to hold true when the leaders' ratings and followers' ratings of competence and commitment are congruent. They stress the importance of finding mutual agreement between leaders and followers on these ratings. Without more research findings to substantiate the way follower commitment is conceptualized, this dimension of situational leadership remains unclear. A fourth criticism of the situational approach has to do with how the model matches leader style with follower development levels. The prescriptions of the model to determine the validity of the prescriptions suggested by Hershey and Blanchard approach in Vecchio in 87 conducted a study of more than 300 high school teachers and their principals. He found that newly hired teachers were more satisfied and performed better under principals who had highly structured leadership styles, but that the performance of more experienced and mature teachers was unrelated to the style their principals exhibited. That's a good one. Vecchio and his colleagues have replicated this study twice. First in 97 using university employees, that's Fernandez and Vecchio in 97, and most recently in 2006 studying more than 800 U.S. military academy cadets, Vecchio and others in 2006. Both studies failed to find scoring evidence to support the basic prescriptions suggested in the situational approach. To further test the assumptions and validity of situational leadership model, Thompson and Vecchio analyzed the original and revised versions of the model using data collected from 357 banking employees and 80 supervisors. They found no clear empirical support for the model in any of its versions. At best, they found some evidence to support leaders being more directive with newer employees and being more supportive and less directive as employees become more senior. Also, Marovich and Gu in 2015, found evidence that followers with more experience indicated a more positive response to autonomy and participation, a finding supporting the importance of leaders being less directive with experienced employees. A fifth criticism of situational leadership is that it fails to account for how certain demographic characteristics, education experience, age, and gender influence the leader-follow prescriptions of the model. For example, a study conducted by Vecchio and Boatwright in 2002 showed that level of education and job experience were inversely related to the directive leadership and were not related to supportive leadership. In other words, followers with more education and more work experience desired less structure. An interesting finding is that age was positively related to desire for structure. The older followers desired more structure than the younger followers did. In addition, their findings indicated that female and male followers had different preferences for styles of leadership. Female followers expressed a stronger preference for supportive leadership, whereas male followers had a stronger desire for directive leadership. These findings indicate that demographic characteristics may affect followers' preferences for a particular leadership style. However, these characteristics are not considered in the situational leadership approach. Situational leadership can also be criticized from a practical standpoint because it does not fully address the issue of one-to-one versus group leadership in an organizational setting. For example, should a leader with a group of 20 followers lead by matching her or her style to the overall development level of the group or to the development level of the individual member of the group? Carew and Blanchard in 1990 suggested that groups go through developmental stages that are similar to individuals, and that therefore leaders should try to match their styles to group development level. However, if the leader matches her or his style to mean development level of a group, how will this affect the individuals whose development levels are quite different from those of their colleagues? Existing research on situational leadership does not answer this question. More research is needed to explain how leaders can adapt their styles simultaneously to the development levels of individual group members and to the group as a whole. A final criticism of situational leadership can be directed at the leadership questionnaires that accompany the model. Questionnaires on the situational approach typically ask respondents to analyze various work situations and to select the best leadership style for each situation. The questionnaires are constructed to force respondents to describe leadership style in the terms of 4 specific parameters: directing, coaching, supporting, and delegating, rather than in terms of other leadership behaviors. Because of the best answers available to respondents have been predetermined, the questionnaires are biased in favor of situational leadership. Graff in 83 and Euclid in 89, they said that. Okay, cool. So we'll stop on there. That is the criticism section. That is on page 102, going all the way through page 104.